May I speak to the upsetter?
Red side.
You know, he's
Red
busy.
right. I.
Magic
I am happiness. I am music. I create lyrics and I create gimmicks.
Anyway, thanks for coming, everybody. Today we've got a couple of new releases. I think you've got the Little Axe, and literally the first copies just come straight off the press of that Lee Perry. So, thanks. Thank you, Steve.
Adrian, we've got to kill half an hour.
20 minutes, Steve. We've done 10 already.
I just want to find out how you came into moving into production, because we know you've spoken quite a bit and quite recently about the kind of soul boy background, but actually, you know, who looked after you? Who's your mentor? Who taught you in the studio?
We had a company called Carib Gems, and I was helping select the releases, and the fellow who ran it, Chips Richards, I ran a first session where myself and my friend Pete Stroud ran a thing and named it Croatian Rebel after the Burning Spear track, and made this band because we were like fans sitting at home smoking spliff listening to reggae. So I hummed the bass lines to this Calypso bass player. We went to studio, hired the musicians, and that man over there, he mixed it for me. We're going, more delay, and Dennis was going, oh man, oh, like that. And at the time, I think Dennis lived strapped to Gooseberry Studios in Chinatown, and I literally bullshitted my way along because I'm not a musician, and one thing I did learn early is get your own sound, and that's what I aspired to do. By all the people I work with, like Prince Farai, he would say, my sound, you know, and everybody that we loved, you know, Augustus Pablo had his own sound, Errol T, Keith Hudson, obviously Lee Perry, everyone had their own sound. That's what made the record so special. And even now, you listen to the good producers, you know, like Mala, Digital Mystics, you can hear his productions, lots of other people, you know, that we like. You can hear they've got their own sound, and that's all I ever aspired to do, to be honest.
Yeah, because it wasn't a kind of classic reggae sound, and I'm glad we fingered Dennis Bevell for being kind of partly instrumental for leading you astray so early. But it wasn't a classic reggae sound because at the same time, like London was coming out of punk, where UK was coming out of punk. There was a lot of kind of industrial noise going on post-punk, so things kind of meshed at that early stage. And your first album wasn't a reggae album, was it? On a new sound.
Well, to me it was, but it wasn't kind of, you know. That
exactly, that's what I'm asking.
I think the thing was, I think Dennis is here for a very good reason tonight, because obviously very important in my history, but also to the history of music generally. His impact's immense. And he's, you know, I know he's getting some recognition. He deserves an immense amount. But the point I was trying to make was the UK scene was always looked, you know, reggae when we started was in the 99p racks. It was looked upon as shit music, like second rate. English reggae was so low down the pecking order that it was his band Matumbi and a few other very important people that backed the Jamaicans and started pushing for our own sound from England. That, you know, I thought there's no point trying to make records that sound like Jamaica because they do it very well. So I think the formation of a kind of sound from this country, which was led by Dennis, and I never thought I wasn't trying to emulate, trying to sound like Channel 1 or something. We just wanted to have like a great drummer, which we always made sure we did have, and that was the kind of guideline for all our work.
Okay, well, talking about great drummers, did the relationship with Stal Scott come through Farai? Because obviously Scotty's been your main collaborator with Dub Syndicate over 30 years. Well, the story of that is really?
Pete Stroud could back me up. We were going to do a tour, and I think we were due to have Carlton Davis come on the tour. And Santa, as he's known, he couldn't come. So Farai said, oh, look, there's this young drummer. And we were thinking, oh, God, no, you know, we want like a really established great one, you know. And he's called Style Scott. He's just come. He wasn't called Style Scott then. He's called Scott. He's just come out of the Jamaican army, and he'd literally done one session in his life and come to England. And he was amongst us before the Radix and everything, because that was Cry Tough and the Originals, which did Dub to Africa. That was actually the first effective Rouch Radix session. So
But that was quite unusual, I would have thought, for a young Jamaican drummer to kind of link up with an English producer to begin to produce in like those rhythms for Dub Syndicate. It sounds like an unusual relationship.
Well,
Because basically the music business was seen to be in Kingston, wasn't it, for most?
It was, but the thing was that what we realised was that the one weak link that in England with all the bands was the drummer. So by bringing up a brilliant drummer, we were going to make our band sound better than anyone else. That was the kind of aim we had. We had to have a great drummer. So we went to all the expense and difficulty of bringing a person. You know, we were only like 19, 20 at the time, bringing people from overseas, sleeping on in my mother's spare room or on the couch or whatever. We'd bring them up and made sure that our band sounded. You know, we were competing with like the early stage Aswad and all the other Tradition and Mutumbi. We had to sound more as rootsy as we could. Yeah.
So how did you meet and become involved with our old friend Bim Sherman?
When I was 16, 17, I travelled from... When I was 17, I got my licence. I travelled from very quickly. In my holiday, I travelled from High Wycombe, which is where I went to school, and up to Harlesden, because I'd known the Palmers through Joe Farquharson since the early 70s. When I was like 13, 14, I first met him, because Harry lived in High Wycombe. And I got a job in the shop. And I remember the first ever Bim Sherman tune coming in. Then a second one came in. I thought, this voice sounds like nothing I'd ever heard. And I was absolutely, besotted with his voice. And then we all sat around at our friend's house listening to Sherman. And then I think Coxon put out that compilation, Love Forever. And we said, oh, look, we've got to get, said to Farai, can you record Sherman for us for Hit Run, for the label we'd started. And he did, although it wasn't the best tune, Love Jar Only and that. And I got Joe Lloyd did another one for us, because I told him about it down in Jam Down with Sly and Robbie. And we then brought him up for the tour in 1979. And sadly, he never ever went back to Jamaica from then. He went back once, but there were some problems with things, with some weed and stuff. And then he ended up not going back again.
But he was remarkably under-recorded for a Jamaican artist, wasn't he? But he seemed to keep control of his output.
Well, the situation, yeah. Well, he was very firm. Contrary to whatever anyone believes, there's only really one Bim Sherman album ever released on You, and that was 1981, Across the Red Sea. Miracle, although it was destined to be an On You album, ended up on Beggar's Banquet, and the rest of it was Singers and Players, which I used that as an umbrella, so that people didn't look like they were over-recorded, because a lot of the artists in those days would be putting out 6 Johnny Clark albums a year and stuff. And if they just made one and worked on the quality control and the promotion a bit better, a lot of those artists like Johnny Clark, Diamond, well, not Diamonds, but a lot of the really good artists, that I think they could have been massive, but they tended, for a quick buck, a lot of them to get over-recorded. And I thought Singers and Players would have been a good umbrella to protect over-recording.
So you mentioned Miracle. Can we just talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's an interesting thing about On You, because we're talking about the On You catalogue, but of course you've done lots of productions, as you said, they've come out that haven't been issued on You Sound, and Miracle was one of them. Can you just talk at which, I mean, I don't know if everybody knows this album, but if you've not heard the album, you really want to check it, because it's one of those kind of, for me, one of those kind of great lost albums in terms of crossing over. I think a lot of On You and Bim fans think it's wonderful, but we did expect great things from it. Can you talk us through the kind of genesis of how that started and how it ended up the album?
Well, I still think a lot of the reggae vocalists are so brilliant, but you wanted to hear the voice more, or the song more. We did an acoustic recording with Skip MacDonald and Bonjo at Southern, where we filmed it. And that kind of spurred me on, so I wanted to make a track just with Bim's voice and very minimal production. And it just coincided with working with Talvin Singh, and then we decided to put like kind of Indian flavour to it. And basically the idea was to have his voice right up front, so you could just say how wonderful his songs and his voice was. And the only reason we didn't release it on You again was lack of finance, and I thought a bigger label could possibly give it a chance of going to a wider arena, to be honest.
So it was one of those situations where, like, basically the concept was just an acoustic album, but it ended up with a fairly lush Bombay string
Well, it
orchestra
still is a kind of
arrangement.
an acoustic album,
Yeah.
and it did do well. It sold quite a lot of copies, but I reckon that should have sold 10 times or 20 times what it sold.
Well, maybe like one of those classic albums, you put it on, it doesn't sound a dated album now, does it? It still sounds...
No, I think it still sounds good. That's 16 years old or something now. That one.
perfectly
15
today.
years old.
Let's talk about, have a word about another key collaborator over the years, who is Bonjo. How did you come into contact with Bonjo?
Well, towards the end of Creation Rebel, he was playing with the band, and he had an interest in kind of not just cliched percussion. He was all, the cliched reggae stuff. He was also into Afro-Cuban and African stuff. So I just decided to do some experimental record with him, because I'd heard that quote of Brian Eno, the Vision of a Psychedelic in Africa quote, and I thought it was a bit corny, but then I thought about it, I thought, oh no, that could be really interesting. And then we just started making kind of all bent up kind of African stuff with little bits of tape. I mean,
But Bonjo came as a master drummer, basically.
Well, say master drummer, he was the best one we had. He was really good.
Yeah.
But then there was all the other things. At the time, I was working with my big mate Mark Stewart, who's lurking in here somewhere, and he was kind of into that Burroughs Geisen thing, cutting up tapes and whatever else. So we were just at the time obsessed with staying in the studios as long as we could and learning what we were doing and experimenting with tape cut-ups and live performance and sonic. So,
and this was, I recall this era, this was early 80s, and this was what would be the pre-digitally era, when we all had bleeding fingers from the from the taped edits on the tape decks. But I remember you using one of the earliest, what's it called, digital harmonizer, the machine produced by AMS out of
Burnley.
Burnley in Lancashire. Can you tell us about like beginning to adapt to that early digital capability? Because and I think it was called captured sound, you called it at the time, rather than sampling.
No, I think everyone, now everyone's got kind of sampling. You can do anything. We used to do it though with Mark. We'd spend hours and hours cutting up and looping bits of tape just to get the sound, and inserting bits of noise into the recordings. And then with the AMS coming along, we could store 1.5 seconds of sound or 3 seconds at half speed and start moving things around. And that was kind of very early, I suppose, sampling that we're doing.
But that was another example of abuse rather than use of the technology, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think you just want to make stuff leap out of the speakers. That was the kind of idea.
Yeah.
And then Mark was pushing stuff, and he come up to me and he said, I want the next album, I want my album to sound like this. This was like 1980 or something. I met him in 79. He said, I want it to sound like this. And he played me a cassette of a Shaka gig. And I did, but it was completely distorted, like recorded in the gig. Yeah. And I thought he meant, the music, but he meant the distorted gig, which is how most of his records sounded until his new album.
Listening back to that first Mark Stewart album, I don't think there's anything been produced so kind of extreme or brutal still.
I think that album, we spent about a year night here, nights and nights and nights on it, and Mark did that. That was kind of his vision of how he wanted to hear Dry Shaka completely mangled up but cut up with. I think to this day, you think that's 30 years old. That's still, Learning to Cut with Cowley still sounds really, really good to me.
Yeah, I think it's became a template for a lot of people who follow, who sometimes, but mostly don't really admit to it. That's kind of classic noise industrial album. But around about the same time, I think, though, in the early to mid 80s, you began to meet people from New York. Was it Tom Silverman specifically? Was that the first contact? Was it?
No, that came through Neil Cooper from
ROI.
He played him a tune. The first tune we ever did with a drum machine was "Watch Yourself" by Akaboo. He played that to Tom. Tom liked it. And he'd heard some of the other On You stuff, and he invited me to New York. But that was spurred on by Mark and Nene and Ari. Ari up there all raving about the things that were going on in New York. and play me, you know, stuff. And then they had Mark in Bristol. They had the Dugout and all the other places we'd go to when I visited them. And there's this kind of that scene going on. They're all checking out the the kind of new hip hop scene in New York. And then I went there and met Double D and Steinsky and all these other characters that were experimenting. A bit later came the Latin Rascals, and they were all doing what we'd been doing, Mark and me, but 100 times more accurately. You know, Mark was deliberately editing him out of time, and they were editing them like massive triplet edits that were bang in. You know.
So how was that kind of mutation of hip hop or playing back of hip hop? How was that greeted in New York? Because Akaboo was released, wasn't it? And you did some mixing for Bambata and.
Well, the thing is, I didn't actually mix for Bambata. I did a few other things for Tommy Boy stuff, but we never did that well. Never sold a lot. People said, "Oh, it sounds good," but didn't quite fit in. To be quite honest with you.
But but some things came out of that, didn't they? And one of them obviously was Tackhead.
Well, that was our relationship with Doug, Skip and Keith, which lasts to this day. And although everyone's gone and done different things and still continues to do that, you know, I think what we've done with Anya, we formed lots of like long-standing friendships, and that's been great. And it's really sad that, you know, like Ari died a week ago this year, you know, and that's really sad for us. And apart, you know. But like I was saying, we still kind of know almost everybody we work with, and it's a lot of good tunes. They still sound good, a lot of the older ones. So.
But that the early Tackhead, though, I mean, there's a real distinction in output really between the early Tackhead and then.
And to get me depressed, Steve. the early
just
Tackhead
admit
was
it.
Well, the early Tackhead was much noisier. Then it got a little bit, you know.
Yeah. Why was that? I mean, it was just so obvious a change between like the first.
Well, I think everybody.
12s.
There's lots of different reasons. I think basically, you know, a combination of, you know, bad drugs and kind of people going off doing different things, and then everything comes to an end. And I think, you know, when you've got people want to do a bit of this, bit of this, bit of this, it doesn't work if it's not focused and really. Like you want to go one direction. If you have something where it's too many Chiefs, not enough Indians, it's best you have one thing that sounds like, okay, that's Little Axe, that's definitively, you know, noisy Tackhead, that's kind of a beautiful singing with Bernard or something, or that's whatever. That works that way.
It always seemed to be more about it came out.
Well, it just collapsed at the end of it.
It came out of the studio and was more a thing where they could actually play live, you know, which I always found more disappointing. But what about the great contenders that never happened? For me, anyway, because some of my favourites on you stuff was Fats Comet. You know, the old idea of Temptations on acid and the utilisation of all those like doo-wop samples, acapellas and whatever was a real surge on the stuff you produced. But that kind of tailed off, didn't it?
I think again it was something that kind of, you know, people loved it that knew it, but it never really just took off. So I just think, you know, I'm not being depressed, but we just kind of, I'd have liked it to have done a lot better. You know, it wasn't from lack of trying. I think they still sound okay now, but they probably were a bit at odds with what was going on at the time, and they didn't quite fit in. And I suppose listening back on them, I can see why they're a little bit quirky or something.
So when you look back on that time, what are the works that you think would, if you're going to represent?
If I was to go through the whole thing, I think loads of them stand. I think that, you know, going through, started the first New Age Steppers, Starship Africa, which predates On You. Those are the year or so before. The you know, the Dub Syndicate recordings, you know, in its time, Tunes from the Missing Channel, Stone Immaculate, obviously the BIM Miracle. I could go on and on. There's lots of them I'm really proud of that still years on sound good. I mean, the best thing I can think of, you look at dance music, it dates, you know, 2 years on, you're not hearing dance tunes in clubs. But with the old reggae and using that technique and that approach of the sonic, you could still play. If you went to Fabric now, you could play in the middle of the night, drop a dub tune from 40 years ago,
of course,
and it would fit in.
Yeah,
and I think with certain of our titles, they sound timeless because they're a bit more edgy or whatever, and others fit in because of the sonic on them, and they still sound good.
Yeah.
So I'm proud of lots of like Time Boom, The Devil Dead, coming onto the Wolf That House Built, Little Axe, and loads of them. I think they're really still, stand the test of time.
Well, you mentioned Time Boom, so let's talk about Mr. Perry then for a while, because it's a long time, really, well over 25 years now since you met Lee and been recording with him, and 3 core albums really, and for me, and I think for most people looking back at Perry's work over that period, it's his best stuff. So what's been his secret of actually working with Lee in the studio and making him look fair, getting out of him what you have got out of him, rather than a lot of the nonsense that people have let him do otherwise?
I think I spent a long time on that first album. I spent a year on that one as well, and then by that time I realised that he's got so many ideas. What you have to do is just cherry pick the ideas, make him enlarge on the ideas, and work to get something that's really cohesive and really good. And he's brilliant to work with because he's never a dull moment. If you go in the studio with him, and there's other people in the studio and they're like falling to sleep or they've got no energy, I've seen him set fire to somebody's foot in the studio that was asleep. He doesn't want anybody in there. If it's in low energy, it's up. Get the place. Believe that you're making magic when you're going to work. That's Lee Perry. So.
But working with you were able to instill some discipline in terms of returning
just all you do is if you've got the luxury of enough studio time and you're paying for it yourself like I was, you just say, look, we're going to come back, keep working until you've got it really good, enlarge the ideas, get a working understanding, and he's fantastic. He's just he's like a baby playing with things. And he's naughty and he's always making mischievous plans, and that's he's your hero. So it's greatest memory ever. I love that.
For sure. I always remember the time that
Heathrow Airport.
There's a Heathrow. Well, there's a couple of stories on Lee. There's the other time. There's the one where you rang me and said, "Oh, Steve, Lee's in the studio," because we wanted him to do a DJ program, but he couldn't come up to Lancashire. So I said, "All right, I'll ring you back." So I rang you back with a load of titles. You shouted the title, and Lee introed it, and then you put it on a DAT and sent it back, and basically that was it.
We released it again.
We cut it together.
Later,
yeah, we released it again. It was all cut up for other tunes. Yeah. And then there was a time we met him at Heathrow Airport. You might want to tell that one.
I can't, because he could get him in. It's illegal.
Oh, shall we whisper it then?
We'll have with that one. Then.
We'll do it when we finish the Heathrow Airport story.
That's another one.
But it all revolved around him getting off the hook because it was his birthday.
Yeah.
And him enjoying it.
That was amazing.
So how is he these days?
I was with Lee 2 Saturdays ago. We did a gig. We do a gig now where he puts a board up and he does a painting. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but he's great. So he sings, and I was like dubbing it up. And they had that 200,000 people on that Occupy Wall Street thing. They were going to occupy the middle of Rome, but some riots went off, and we're playing right in the middle of that. So I did a gig with a Greeting Citizens of Rome gig, where he was like cursing the Pope for the whole evening. It was like, oh, no. But while he was painting, so the people seemed to like it.
So he's still on form.
Yeah, no, he's fantastic. He's 76 in March.
Yeah.
And this was like 4 o'clock in the morning. He was up for partying, he's great.
So that was Lee from around about 1986 or so, the first 85, 86, the first times. The other album, which I think was like a really critical piece of work, which is you shared, it never came out on you, came out on World Enterprises or World Records, was Major Malfunction. Keith LeBlanc,
that really is a tacked album, but
which is an incredible, is still an incredible listening album, isn't it? It's one of the drum albums you can actually listen to all the way through. Do you want to tell us about the genesis of that?
That album, we started on a Thursday night, and we finished on about 2 o'clock on a Monday morning, from beginning to end. So we just all of us in the studio. Mark ended up singing Object Subject on one of the rhythms, but we're just cutting rhythms all weekend. One person's recording the drums, overdubbing the bass, mixing them, voicing them, upstairs editing them, and then we just finished it. And it coincided with that weekend was the space shuttle disaster.
Yeah.
And that was it.
That was the major
it was a really-
malfunction.
You know, a lot of good records are made. It was made in 3 days. That
Yeah.
album. That's it.
No, it struck me that that was a kind of a classical style on you, where the thing was actually generated and made in a very short period of time. Whereas these days, I mean, how long do you take to make an album? You know, as long as you want, really. I'm not
Well,
you.
I think you
but
can
you
over polish. I
particularly.
think you can over polish something if you can make it just capture something. You know, some of the records took a year to make. Others made really fast. So.
Mm. Well, that seems to be the thing about Little Axe, doesn't it? Because there's quite a few reviews of the new Little Axe album, which is on the table over there for sale, isn't
It's
it?
very good.
Yeah.
If anybody would like.
If you want loyalty,
If you want loyalty, buy a dog.
Buy
It's
a
called.
dog.
It's a good album.
And basically a lot of the reviews are saying, well, this is how we prefer Little Axe, which is like pared back and a little bit more minimal and raw and edgy, which goes back right to the first album, doesn't it?
Well, this album I kind of produced more than the Real World ones. Although the Real World ones we did co-produce them, they were kind of under a guideline. So this is more like an On You album. Because the only other On You Little Axe album, there was The Wolf That House Built, and there's another one that's great if anyone can get it. It's still called Hard Grind,
Fat
which is
Possum
not
came out.
which is
Fat
not
Possum.
very well known. Yeah, Fat Possum in America, and this one as well.
Mm. And I suppose that's another area that needs acknowledgement, really, because people say, what is blues, dub, etc. But the early Little Axe albums had a tremendous influence, actually, in America, didn't it? Because lots of people kind of followed on, utilising the kind of same techniques, really, notably Moby, so millions of records, but also even down to people like R.L. Burnside and Junior Kimbrough and T-Model 4 were doing blues remixes.
Well, they're a really good bunch. That Fat Possum lot. I like them a lot.
So you visited Mississippi to
I wanted
do a deal?
I was going to go to Mississippi, but I didn't get to go there with Matthew and them. I'd love to go.
Yeah. Well, they're doing pop music now, Adrian. So.
Times they are a-changing, mate.
The other artist I think is quite interesting for On You sound, for me, is a guy you worked with right at the start, and you're still working with, is Jeb Loy Nichols, where he cut a tune for him on one of the early compilations, and just done an album that's been released in Japan. Can you tell us a little bit about the new Jeb Loy album?
Yeah, I'll play a track off that in a minute, because that's coming. There's a song called "To Be Rich," which has become a little bit of an anthem at the moment. We actually opened up in Rome with that last week. It's a great track. Well, Jeb's was a singer-songwriter, and he actually cut his first 2 tunes on a visit when he came over from New York with Nena Cherry in 1981. That ended up on Cherry Red label. This label, and. No, Jeb's a really good singer-songwriter. So that's
And I mean, if there was an album of Adrian Sherwood remixes, his tune "As the Rain" must be one of the top remixes, certainly for a lot of your.
Honestly, I've forgotten about that tune.
You've
It's
forgotten
a
all
lovely
about
tune.
it's a
nice
lovely tune.
yeah.
What about all those people you've done productions for? Which ones have you really looked back on and that's just a big list, isn't it, these days? Which ones do you look back on and think, well, I did some good work there?
Well, for me, what tended to happen was I tended to get brought in more to do the weird B-side or the weird remix for the record company to add extra sales. That's what used to happen. They used to have like a tactic to try and get their records in the charts. So looking back on productions I've done for other people, it's difficult. Like whole albums, you mean, of work.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few.
Well, then I did Ministry and a few other bits that were all good. But I could have done more, but I was really concentrating trying to get the label to multiply its sales by 10 and never quite made it.
One that really stands out to me is the album, your dub album you did with Primal Scream.
I know I'm very proud of the Echo Deck. If anyone, that's a great album. I like that album. So.
And because there was an Augustus Pablo.
Well, that was really sad
on that,
because
wasn't it?
and at the same time we were going to do a Bob Marley dub album where, but then Bill Laswell did an album, and then the Marley estate pulled the plug on that.
Oh, right.
But we had Pablo ready to blow on the tracks and everything, and then, anyway, it's not possible now.
So then it evaporated.
Yeah.
I remember that 15 years ago there was, the 15 years anniversary in what's loosely called business for a new sound, I think. It doesn't seem like you've often treated this as a kind of label as such, or a business. I mean, how would you describe it yourself?
Well, that album we did 15 years of what can loosely be described as business. I think was a logo or something at the time. But I think we just tried basically to be a print that could, try and give some of the people who were with a stepping stone, not really taking the label probably as seriously as we should have done. But in hindsight, but looking back on it, I think the legacy is pretty good, and I'm just glad I'm sat here 30 years on and still able to do, put tunes out.
So we've talked about the Jeb album, which is out in Japan, I think, on a different label, but they may be released.
It's on You in Japan.
On You in Japan, but may be released in.
That'll be released. That'll be one of the bunch next year. The next releases is going to be there's a New Age Steppers record that Ari made before she died, which we finished this week, which is wonderful. I was finished with my engineer Dave McEwen up to yesterday, to be honest. Then I've got a new solo album which I've nearly finished, which will be released next March.
Is that for On You Sound?
That's coming on You. It's all coming on You as well.
So there's no real world.
No, I don't really want to do that anymore.
Required.
No, I'm not going to do that anymore.
No.
And then there's new albums by Crispy Horns with Rouch Radix and Dub Syndicate, which is a lovely album. There's a Ghetto Priest record called Sacred Ground, which is finished as well. And there's several other projects that are really good that I've nearly finished. So.
Well, thanks very much.
It's the 31st.
It's
beyond.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for coming as well. So we're going to play some tunes now and everything.
Thanks very much, Eddie.
Thank you very much.
Within our heart, how much I love Jah. He never leave I to cry. I and I days and I night never lonely, just like a king on a holy throne. How much I love Jah. He never leave I to cry. La 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 la. Oh Jah Jah. Just like the river